Welcome to another episode of the SNA Speakeasy. Today we are talking to a fellow journalist. His name is Brett Bull, and he runs and founded the very popular website and news service called Tokyo Reporter. And we're going to find out a little bit about that and a little bit about his approach to journalism and the stories that he covers. So first of all, Brett, you know, many people are aware of your site, but they may not know how and why it came into existence. So, can you please kind of give us some background as to how and why you created Tokyo Reporter?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me on. The site started in 2008, and before that, I was contributing to a friend's site. At the time, I've always been interested in news, and so my friend asked me when I moved to Japan, probably starting 1998 or so when I moved to Japan, he said, why don't you provide me some coverage of what's going on in Japan? So I did. I was writing feature stories, and the coverage was kind of similar to what the Tokyo Reporter is now. A lot of coverage of crime type stories, but they were more long form. So in 2008, I decided, there's WordPress. It's really easy to use. So why don't I adopt that on my own site? And then I could have this more rapid fire approach to these shorter stories that are sort of like street level news that I think that kind of thing is sort of missing in Japan in the coverage that I see nowadays. You've got mainstream sites covering, the politics, the economy, and then there's other sites that are more focused on culture. And that's totally understandable. But I thought there has been something missing sort of in between. And I think the Tokyo Reporter sort of fills that with coverage of a lot of crime, scandals, and, things like that.
Of all of the fields of possible journalism in Japan, what was it that attracted you to this style of crime journalism as opposed to everything else?
I've always been interested in crime. I think probably my favorite movie is LA Confidential. I think Danny DeVito's great in that. And so I sort of think of it, not quite like that, but almost similar, right? So I really loved reading Raymond Chandler novels, Dashiell Hammett, all that stuff when I was really young in college and stuff. So no, I was always interested in it. And here I came to Japan and I realized that there's a very vibrant criminal element that largely goes unnoticed as far as like in the English press. So I thought, well, that's something, and I've always been interested in writing. So I slowly developed a certain style, and now with the Tokyo Reporter site, going back to what I said before, it's just this rapid fire of short stories. Some are longer than others, but maybe 200-word stories that people can read easily and hopefully get an idea of what's going on. Get an idea of what's happening, and in a way that they hadn't realized before.
Well, certainly, if people are looking for crime stories, you're basically the go-to place to get that information. So, I guess there's lots of dimensions of this, but you know, how do you think that the journalism that you're doing, focusing on crime, shapes or better informs people's how should we say, views of Japan and sense of what's going on in this society?
Well, going back to what I said earlier, that there really is, the mainstream press covers certain topics, and I do think there's a gap. And Japan is often misunderstood. It's you've got the weird Japan stories. You've got a lot of this focus on the culture aspect, like the way things used to be back in the old days and how that exists today. But I think that there is something missing that makes Japan seem very real. And it's almost like we're living in a fantasy, almost. And so I think that the site does give you, that they're actually, these are real people who've got real imperfections, and they're played out every day. And I think the site shows that.
And how hard is it to find these stories? As you say, you're doing these small, rapid fire stories on a multiple times per day. Is it hard to track down sources? My understanding, for example, if you're going for primary sources, is that the Japanese police agencies aren't necessarily very communicative about a lot of things.
Well, the site as it is, no, I make no bones about it. I mean, I'm just rewriting what exists in the Japanese news. So, I mean, the original reporting on my site is pretty small. It used to be a lot more before, and I used to do my own, and I still do my own. But most of it is just I'm just reading what comes in the equivalent of a wire. I mean, it's in Japanese. I have a certain way of picking out what stories interest me and perhaps would interest the readership. So I over the years I've sort of refined how I pick these stories out, and it's very easy. This is a never-ending stream of material coming through the Japanese news, and I just have time to do a certain number per day or per week. But to answer your question, I think it's actually very important, was the one about talking to the police. And it's actually, yeah, you're right. It's very difficult. I've been, I do some other writing, not just the Tokyo Reporter. I've done stories for the Japan Times and, publications like that. And I've gone to the police. Sometimes I've had success with the National Police Agency, for example, but the Tokyo Police Department is extremely difficult to deal with. They require you to be a member of the Keisha Club, in my experience, and they make it extraordinarily difficult for you to even get a simple answer from them. And I know a lot of foreign correspondents who are like real foreign correspondents working for big papers. They complain about not being members of the Keisha Club, but I don't know that you would really gain anything from it, too much anyway, because it's all, if you look at what the Japanese press put out through the Keisha Club system, it's almost a copy and paste exercise. So what I'm doing is I mostly rely on what comes through, the stream I read, and then I put it into an English version.
Well, okay, if that's where your sources are coming from, what about reactions? I mean, you mentioned that you've learned over the time what it is that the readers want. So what is your sense of the types of stories that really kind of make people respond?
Well, my readership, if I look at Google Analytics, I'd say mostly is from the United States, or probably maybe half United States, half Japan. So a lot of foreigners living in Japan or people speaking English in Japan. And so they're interested in what other foreigners are doing. So foreigners involved in crime, that'll get a lot of attention. And then as well, I think anything that shows the discrepancy between the United States or the West and Japan is huge. So, like, for example, marijuana is dealt with very strictly in Japan. And in the United States, of course, it's quasi-legal, right? So anytime there's a marijuana bust in Japan, people really want to read about it because they find it absurd. On the other hand, we've got gun control problems in the United States. There's mass shootings and whatnot. So in Japan, when there's even a minor incident with a gun, I mean, there are a few incidents, every few months, usually involving some Yakuza of some kind. And again, you sort of get the reverse. It's like, well, gee, if this had been the United States, there would be such and such number of people dead or whatever. So I'd say those two topics. Anything that shows like a difference between the United States and Japan is huge. Then anything, you'd be surprised actually. It's almost like rolling dice. There was a story last year that was huge. It was this woman who stabbed her boyfriend while he was sleeping. Got massive attention because she was sort of modeling, or her actions were sort of modeled after this anime genre. So it became huge in the United States. People, anime is quite popular, and so she typified this in real life, and it became a huge story. I mean, and as well, it was quite a graphic story. The guy was bleeding in the stairwell. The emergency services found him in the lobby, and he survived. And that added to the story, So, but it's really, actually, it's not really easy to decide beforehand what's going to be a hit and what's not. It's, nowadays everything is up to Google's algorithms, Twitter's algorithms, Facebook's algorithms. I mean, so picking what's going to be a hit, I'm not really sure all the time.
Doing political news, I certainly know what you mean. I mean, sometimes I think I know what's going to be a hit and I'm wrong, and other times people will pick up on something I didn't expect. All right. So, with more than a decade's experience doing this sort of crime beat in Japan. What kind of changes, or have you felt any changes in society, any movements that's going on that stories that maybe 10 years ago were quite rare but are now more common, or vice versa?
Recently, I can't really say 10 years ago, but I could go back further than that. I started digging through an old English newspaper archives, and I started looking up Japan stories. So we're talking like the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, maybe, and even the 1980s. And I realized that the coverage back then was far more detailed. I mean, far more detailed. And it really struck me. I put up a story, it was about 4 months ago or so. It was about a businessman who fatally bludgeoned his his partner at the Imperial Hotel in 1959, I think it was. And if you look at this, and this became a huge story. It's actually, if you look up on the internet right now, there's no mention of it. But if you look in this newspaper archive, this story was updated like almost daily. It became this courtroom drama because it unfolded over the course of a year, and the detail was unbelievable. I mean, nowadays, you're lucky in fact, no police officer would ever be named. No prosecutor is ever named. But in these stories, you had the prosecutor named. You had the police officer named. You had, in the court, you had the judge was named. Everybody. I mean, it brought so much to this story. And I put it up on my site, referencing where I was getting all the material and everything. And I'd always thought this before. I'd always realized that the things had changed where, as I described to you, my stories are all coming from the Japanese. And I think a lot of others do the same, similar things. The topics are different, but the idea is the same. You're getting it from the Japanese and then reworking it into English. But something changed over the course of, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years ago. Now, a lot of that's probably because bureaus in Tokyo are shrinking, so there's not that much of a chance to actually focus on a certain story where you might rely on a wire now or whatever. But wow, I mean, I was really blown away. There's another story too. Same year or right around the same time, the stewardess, BOAC stewardess, now British Airways, she was murdered, and same sort of thing. I mean, a Catholic priest was not a suspect, but he was suspected in the case, and again, this dragged out for months, and it was such a big deal, and I could see in those days, but. Nowadays, it's really tough to get a story about Japan, even like a really grisly one. And then there's plenty of grisly stories from Japan that happen, fairly regularly. To make it big news, we had the story, those 9 bodies that were dismembered in Zama City about 2 years ago. That story was pretty popular. But if you go back and look at the art, I mean, it's a totally different sort of thing. I mean, it was like almost daily updates of a story that I don't think would get the same sort of attention nowadays.
And I have noticed there's occasionally some overlap between what you do and what SNA does, in the sense that when we're talking about political scandals, you do seem to have some coverage of that as well. Where do you kind of draw the line in terms of what it is, the things you're interested in terms of the coverage for Tokyo Reporter?
I don't know that I really draw a line. I just think of what I can do. It's just kind of what I come across. So if it's a boring scandal, I might not touch it. If it's just a money thing, I don't know. It just depends. It actually depends on the story. What was it? What was I? Trying to remember. Anyway, I don't know, but yeah, it just depends on what the story is. If it's a nice scandal, I think I had one of the first stories, an English version of the Moritomo Gakuen scandal. I saw it in the Asahi over the weekend, and then I put up a version of it on Monday, and I was pretty sure I had the first version of that up in English. And so it just depends. I mean, it seemed like a heck of a story back when it first broke in the Asahi. It was the Asahi Shimbun that did it. So it just depends. Just depends what I can get to. There's only a limited amount of time in the day. But you're right. Politics isn't the focus so much, but I do get to it.
And how about your own interests? I mean, over the course of the time that you've been doing this, have you noticed a shift in the types of stories in which the ones which interest you to know more? Has that changed at all over the time you've been doing this?
Um, I think things come and go. I think actually, recently what I've noticed is, yeah, the site is developed. It develops. It doesn't stay the same. So what I've noticed over the last couple of years is, people who don't get prosecuted, they aren't indicted. That's really surprising. Actually, I wasn't aware of that a couple of years ago, probably 3-4 years ago, and it's just recently I realized, once I latch onto a certain type of thing, I'll follow it for the next time. And yeah, these non-indictments, I mean, just because even when the perpetrator admits to it, very mysteriously, the charges will be, he won't be prosecuted and he'll be, let go. And oftentimes, a lot of rape cases are like that. And the gang rape cases where there's a drugging involved. And I mean, and then they'll say that no reason was given for the non-prosecution. That kind of thing I wasn't aware of, maybe 5 years ago, but now I see it happen regularly. I've noticed that. I'm always amazed at how easy it is for people to, like, I'm amazed at how complicated a story can get. Like some of these murder stories in Japan where a body is found in a river or in the mountains buried or something, it doesn't just all of a sudden you just kill the person and dump the body. There's many steps in a lot of these, and I'm always amazed, or I'm regularly amazed at how many steps there are where nobody blows the whistle. Like, it seems like if you're moving a body around and you're getting help from other people, that somebody would raise a concern with somebody in authority and it would end there. But actually the body gets taken all the way to the forest or whatever and dumped and found maybe 2 years later, and then you're left to piece together all those steps. And and when I go back and try to piece together those steps, I'm always amazed at how long this goes on without anybody becoming aware of it.
When you talk about the non-prosecution, that's one of the things which has driven me up the wall in the recent years, especially things like the Kansai Electric Power Company. Huge bribery scandal. Dozens of executives admit having been bribed, and there's no prosecution, zero prosecution. And also with the Kawais in Hiroshima right now, dozens of politicians say yes, we took money, but the prosecutors don't go after them. Do you have any sense of how it is that somebody can admit they've done a crime, and yet prosecutors don't do anything? This is something that's a mystery to me.
I don't have any knowledge of that, but you sort of get the idea that there's deals being made. I mean, the prosecutors, they'll, I think, like, when I went back to that rape case, oftentimes you can tell what has happened, sort of unofficially, and that's like, There'll be like the reference Kankesha, the related person in this case, has said that an out-of-court settlement was reached. Now, they won't say that's the reason that there's been the non-prosecution, but it's in there for a reason, obviously. So you're supposed to think, well, that's actually why, right? So they've dropped the case, or the person hasn't been indicted because they reached an out-of-court settlement with the victim, right? So just in my, over time, I guess that's just sort of what prosecutors are always shooting for, a way to, not continue the case. And as far as politics, I really don't know.
What about the public? I mean, are you running across references to like concerned citizens who are doing sort of anti-crime movements of any kind in Japan, or is it all come from the officials, or is there any kind of bottom up sort of anti-crime lobby that you get hints of in your coverage?
Well, I think the Me Too movement in Japan didn't get a huge amount of traction. I mean, we had the Sori Ito case, but there was one. But that one, she very bravely went ahead with her case in spite of all a lot of opposition. But there was another case where the man was accused of raping his daughter repeatedly, and he got off. And then that resulted in a protest. I don't remember the details. I think it was down in Aichi. I don't want to say the wrong case. I could look it up later. But that case, there were protests after that. And so it does seem to me that there is, when it comes to Me Too type topics, there is a little more interest in Japan, although it still probably is quite small compared to other places.
So essentially, you think that mainly it's for crime stories, it's all basically just the prosecutors leaking information to the press club media, and that's more or less what we know about crime in Japan? Or are there other places where, information's coming to the public?
Well, I don't think that. I think you got to kind of step back and see, like, how is this working, right, in Japan? I think it's a little bit. It's not something that's really clear if you just watch the news. I think if I say, like, okay, so I mentioned that I have this feed that I read. I'll tell you, at around 12 o'clock Monday through Friday, you can go and check out any of the four major networks. You can see Fuji TV, NTV, TV Asahi, TBS News, and they'll drop all their crime stories basically for the day, and almost at the same time. So there's some sort of a deal with the police where they all do it all at the same time. So they're being fed these stories to run, at basically the same time. And so I don't know how the relationship is working, but what I am saying is that there's obviously some sort of there's a deal involved. I mean, where they're providing, the police are providing this data or information to you to run sort of as like a public relations. I really think that if you think of the police in Japan more as like public relations, I think that's a better idea of what they're delivering. Because then I think actually the public sort of expects that too. I mean, they're supposed to present a certain, I don't know, image is the right way, but a certain sort of protocol of how to do things. There was a case just last, it was August. There was down in Kumamoto. Like 40 years ago, this man and woman were abducted, I guess by North Korean agents, right? So, and North Korea says that both these people have died. And Japan is even they're convinced that these two were abducted. Now, whether they're dead or not, it's not sure. But the police, on the anniversary of the abduction, they went out and they had life-size cardboard cutouts, and they put them at the side of the road, and they were stopping motorists to, say, hey, did you see? And this was 40 some odd years ago. So they're doing this performance. So it's like, and literally, there's a quote in the article where the officer is saying, well, we're doing this as a part of public relations. It's just a colossal waste of time, right? But they just want to keep that, that they're working, they're doing what people expect. And so I think actually it is more of that sort of public relations. That's sort of what the goal is. And I think that is what people expect. They do it for when there's unsolved cases. They also go through a similar sort of, it's like a show. I mean, even during the Oshogatsu or the holidays, they'll do the parade through the red light district, Kabukicho. They'll be warning about, rip-off bars and fraud and whatnot, and it's just sort of, it's very marginal of marginal value, I think.
Turning a little bit to the Japanese media, how do you evaluate the main different sections? I mean, obviously there's the standard dailies like Asahi, Yomiuri, and then there's sort of the weekly magazines who have their own very unique role, and then maybe there's kind of like the kiosk tabloids like Yukon Fuji or something like this. Do you feel that you can put equal weight on what they're saying, or do you feel that some are really getting the story better than the others? What's your sense of these sources?
Well, I read them all. But I'll say this. Okay, so when the site started in 2008, I had a lot of tabloid coverage. I had a lot of Shukan Jitsu, Shukan Taishu. These are like pretty, like you said, the weekly tabloids, Shukan Post, this kind of thing. But then I realized something. I realized that, and I wasn't doing a lot of these like silly stories, I was doing more of like, there were crime stories. So like, a weekly it takes an incident that happens on a particular day, and then because it's weekly, it doesn't report it in a daily sense. It tries to make it into some kind of trend. So like, foreigner gets murdered in Roppongi or something, right? They'll try to say, well, this is part of some, dirty dealings involving prostitution and certain gangs or something, and it could be a bunch of garbage. But what I realized was that if I read that story, why don't I just write the story that happened like in the daily? So, invariably, like TV Asahi or Fuji TV would have the actual murder itself on that day. Why don't I just write that? Why am I going to wait for the weekly to do it? So then I started ignoring the weeklies pretty much. Although I do still, do look at some of the. I do still look at them, but I realized that a lot of what the weeklies are doing is they're just taking the dailies stuff and reworking it. So I don't have an infinite amount of time. So let me just cut it off, and then I'll just look at the daily stuff. So that's kind of my thing.
And so, what do you feel about? I mean, myself, I very rarely look at the daily tabloids, but do you feel that the information they're giving is accurate, or do you think that that they're just simply interested in a different kind of news than the sort of mainstream dailies? But how much do you think they embellish?
I think it totally depends on the magazine and on the type of the story. Like if you look at like Shukan Bunshin, Shukan Shinso, they do a lot of political scandals that have resulted in people having to resign, right? But then if you get down to like Spa or Shukan Post or something, they've got a lot of stuff like certain announcers dating some guy or whatever, and it's pretty useless. But you know that going in, right? So I think that you got to understand like, well, what magazine is it, and what is the content of the story? So if you look at like, you can look at other, like Shukan Jitsuo have some amusing stories, but it goes back to what I said. If you know what you're looking for, you can use pieces of probably anything. It's just a matter of picking out what you want.
All right. And second to last question, I think, before we move to the patron Q&A, is looking at Tokyo Reporter and your own future and how you're looking to develop it. What kind of, do you have a sense of what kind of goals of where you want to head with the site and where you want to head with the service? Or basically, do you feel that you're in a groove now and you just need to continue reporting the news?
That's a great question. A lot of it actually goes back to what I do enjoy doing it generally. So there's that, right? But as far as growing the site, that's I've realized that I'm almost powerless. The content of course matters, but it's really up to the algorithms. I've realized that some of these things I just out of my hands. I can keep up to date on the latest in WordPress, the latest in Google's, however they analyze the site, the site, the speed of the site loading and all this other stuff. But it's almost out of my hands. So I don't know. I have thought a little bit about trying to maybe make the site so that it's got more in-depth stories, like more of my own kind of, and less relying on these news sources. I actually I do get a little tired of reading them because they repeat so much. So to keep it fresh, I would like to just do some more of my own styled reporting, which what I was doing before. So that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, I can totally empathize with that because I'm always trying to figure out should I be doing more short form journalism to get a wider net, or do what I really want to do is long form investigative journalism once a month and try to get a lot of, and hopefully get so much impact that way. Have you how have you gone in your own mind in this debate?
Well, I think it goes back to what you were saying. You had no idea, or you often have no idea what's going to be a hit. So I think you have to do what you want to do, right? And then hope that others follow you, right? I guess. Because I really don't see how you can guess, unless you've got some CEO, SEO mastermind working with you. I do not know how you game the system to whereby you're going to attract this massive following, this massive attention. I think you have to just do what you want to do, what you find interesting. Yeah, that's really it.
Okay. And before we go to the patron Q&A, I'll give you my traditional last question to an interview, which is there something that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you that you'd like to comment on?
Not exactly. I was, when we started, I was interested in how you found the site originally, and I appreciated that. Twitter's pretty tough. I have a fair following on there, but wow, I think I've run afoul of the algorithm on that as well. It's a really finicky sort of a platform, but yeah.
No, they all are. I feel like it's kind of like a conveyor belt, and you get 3 steps ahead, and you turn around, and you're actually 3 steps behind. Not just Twitter, but YouTube and all the social media, Facebook. I completely understand what you're saying. I mean, it seems like it's kind of a loser's race in many ways.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. It's really you're like rudderless, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. So now we will move to the patron Q&A.